Hello, I'm Chloe. The fateful day that forever changed my life seemed like something out of a fairy tale, at least at first. It was my wedding day, a day I had looked forward to with a blend of excitement, hope, and a dash of youthful naivety. The venue was awash in pastel hues, with flower arrangements meticulously placed to enhance the romantic ambience. I felt like a princess in my voluminous white gown, the delicate lacework of my veil falling around me like a cascade of softness. I was always a bit of a romantic, the kind of person who believed in soulmates and happily ever afters. Ben, my groom, had this brooding charm I found irresistible. He was introverted, contemplative, and I mistook his inward nature for depth. We met in college, endured the usual ups and downs of young love, and then decided that we were it for each other. So there I was, waiting in the bridal suite for the moment to walk down the aisle to etch our promises into the everlasting ledger of matrimony. "Chloe, you look absolutely radiant, my maid of honor," Sarah gushed as she helped me with the finishing touches. "Thank you, Sarah. I've dreamed of this day for so long, and now it's finally here," I replied, hardly containing my excitement. As the ceremony neared, Ben came into the room for our first look. There he was in his black tuxedo, looking undeniably handsome but oddly detached. His eyes met mine, but the emotional connection I yearned for seemed missing. "You look beautiful, Chloe," he said, but his words lacked warmth. "Is this everything again? You seem distant," I cautiously inquired. "I'm fine, just a bit nervous, that's all," he brushed it off. I wanted to delve deeper, but chose to keep the peace. "We'll be fine, Ben. I love you." "I love you too," he replied, but his eyes were far away. Then came the introduction to the woman who would morph into the tormentor of my life, Karen, Ben's mother. Dressed in an ostentatious outfit that screamed, "Look at me," she wore an expression that oscillated between condescension and scrutiny. She had the kind of stare that made you feel as though she were peeling away your layers, analyzing each one for flaws. "Chloe, dear, you look, well, satisfactory for my son," she remarked, her words intentionally chosen to needle me. I took a deep breath, put on a plastic smile, and replied, "Thank you, Karen." "Oh, you're very welcome," she said, her voice laced with saccharine sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. During these awkward interactions, Ben remained noticeably silent. Even as his mother's words hung heavily in the air, he said nothing, did nothing, his compliance effectively condoning her actions. In that moment, I thought it was just wedding day stress affecting us all. Oh, how wrong I was! By the time the ceremony was over and we were declared husband and wife, the excitement of the day had given way to a lurking unease. But amid the clinking of champagne glasses and the background noise of laughter and chatter, I pushed those feelings aside. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had no idea it was merely the calm before an endless storm, the first chapter in a tale of disillusionment and struggle. It was a promise wrapped in satin and lies, a promise that led me down a path I had never envisioned, shattering my romantic notions and forcing me to confront uncomfortable truths about love, loyalty, and the bitter complexities of human relationships. And so, as I stood there, a newlywed flushed with a mix of joy and apprehension, I had no inkling of how drastically my life was about to change. But change it did in ways both profound and heartbreaking. Little did I know, my tale was one that would pivot from dream to nightmare, compelling me to find a strength I never knew I had. This is my story. I remember when Ben and I crossed the threshold of what was now our shared home, the air around us thick with the afterglow of wedding festivities. Our house was a cozy, two-story building with a garden that I loved to tend on weekends. I'd always imagined it filled with laughter and love, a sanctuary for our burgeoning family. Yet, as I looked at Ben, who seemed distracted while unpacking his belongings, my intuition sounded faint alarms. That's when the honeymoon phase began, though it was anything but typical. Ben was still in between jobs, as he liked to put it, a state of affairs that was becoming increasingly permanent. I had a job in online marketing that I loved and was quite good at. The pay was substantial enough to support us both comfortably. "Hey, Ben, have you heard back from any of the jobs you've applied for?" I asked him one day as I was working on my laptop. I tried to make my voice as gentle as possible, avoiding any hint of criticism. He glanced up from his video game. "Not yet, but something will come along." "Okay, just keep me updated. We have bills and everything, I added, my voice tinged with concern. He just shrugged and turned his attention back to his game. Around this time, Karen started her routine visits. To say that she was a frequent visitor would be an understatement. She practically established a revolving door policy at our house. Each time she arrived, it was like a dark cloud settling over our home. And each visit would unfailingly include her needling me about my unconventional job. "So, Chloe, when are you planning to get a real job?" she'd say, contempt dripping from her words as she surveyed the house with a disdainful eye. "A job's a job, Karen," I'd reply tersely. "I make good money and have a career I'm proud of." "But you're home all the time, hardly the sign of a career woman," she'd retort, her eyes meeting mine with a challenging glint. "Mom, it's a different world now. People work from home." Ben would finally speak up, but his tone was so passive, almost like he was asking for permission to have an opinion. But Karen would steamroll right over him, as she did with everyone else. Well, times may have changed, but values shouldn't. A man should provide for his family. Ben wouldn't respond, letting the silence speak volumes, and I would be left simmering with resentment that would last long after Karen had departed. You see, these weren't isolated events, but part of a disturbing pattern. Ben's passivity, his refusal to defend me, our relationship, against his mother's blatant disrespect was a constant source of tension. Deep down, I knew something was off, but the complicated web of love, duty, and societal expectations made it hard for me to act. I had been raised to be accommodating, to believe in the sanctity of family, even when that family was tearing at the fabric of myself. Respect. But the most unsettling part, it was the creeping realization that the man I married was not the ally I had hoped for, but a spectator in the downward spiral that was becoming my life. And as Karen's grip tightened, it was Ben's detachment that hurt the most. It felt like he had mentally checked out of our marriage, a silent bystander in a play where I was unwittingly cast as the tragic heroine. I thought the honeymoon phase was supposed to be blissful, a time to bask in post-wedding happiness. Instead, it was a confusing, emotionally draining period that sowed the seeds of doubt and discord in what should have been sacred ground. Each day, I found myself questioning not just my marriage, but also my own judgment. Had I made a colossal mistake? And more terrifyingly, was this the life that awaited me? Endless cycles of disrespect and emotional neglect wrapped in the flimsy veneer of matrimonial bliss. As the weeks turned into months, I pushed these questions aside, attributing the tension to adjustment issues that I hoped would eventually resolve themselves. But deep down, a small, persistent voice kept whispering, "Something's not right here, Chloe. Something's really not right." And as much as I tried to ignore it, the unsettling truth was that this voice was becoming harder and harder to silence. Just when I thought my emotional landscape couldn't become any more complicated, life threw another curveball my way. I was pregnant. With twins, no less. I felt a cocktail of emotions. Joy at the prospect of motherhood, terror at the responsibilities it entailed, and, sadly, a gnawing unease about how Ben and Karen would fit into this new equation. I decided to tell Ben first, hoping that the news would somehow snap him back to the present, make him realize the magnitude of our reality. "Ben, can we talk? I have something important to share," I said one evening after dinner, my voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "Sure, what's up?" he replied, pausing his video game and turning to me. I took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant, Ben. We're going to have twins." I watched his face for any sign of emotion. It morphed from surprise to something I couldn't quite decipher, certainly not the elation or warmth I had hoped for. "Twins? Wow, that's unexpected," he finally said, his tone flat, lacking the enthusiasm this moment deserved. "Unexpected but wonderful, right? We're going to be parents." I tried to infuse some joy into the conversation, compensate for his lackluster reaction. "Yeah, sure, wonderful," he replied, but his words felt empty. Any lingering joy I felt evaporated. A milestone that should have been a cause for celebration had instead become a glaring spotlight on the fractures in our relationship. I went to bed that night pondering the lonely journey that lay ahead, unsure of what my future, or that of my unborn children, held. Then came the hurricane that was Karen. Ben had apparently shared the news with her because she showed up on our doorstep the next day with suitcases in tow. "Darling, I've decided to move in with you to help with the babies," she announced, as if bestowing upon us some great honor. I was stunned. "That's a big decision, Karen." Ben stepped in, but not in my defense. "Mom's got a point, Chloe." Once again, I was outnumbered. Once again, Ben had sided with his mother over his wife. And so, our trio of tension became a quartet, adding layers of complexity to an already challenging situation. Karen didn't so much move in as she did invade our lives. She set her own rules, treating me more like a live, in maid than a daughter, in-law. "You need to clean the house, Chloe. It's filthy," she'd snap, despite the fact that I was heavily pregnant and already stretched thin with work and household chores. "And you, Ben, can't you find some work so Chloe doesn't have to play the man in the house?" she'd add, targeting her son but hitting me with the shrapnel of her words. "Mom, we're doing fine," Ben would mutter, but his protests were feeble, making no impact on Karen's behavior or on the dynamic within our home. Pregnancy is supposed to be a special time, one of anticipation and family bonding, but my experience was marred by tension, disrespect, and a profound sense of loneliness. I was carrying two lives inside me, yet I had never felt so isolated. The home that should have been my sanctuary had turned into a battlefield, and I, heavily pregnant and emotionally drained, was left to navigate it alone. The universe had granted me two blessings in the form of my unborn twins. But it had also thrown in a curse, my increasingly complicated, painful life circumstances. The woman who should have been my partner in this beautiful journey was turning into my most persistent antagonist, and the man who should have been my rock was morphing into a shadowy figure of indifference. Two blessings and a curse, that summed up this chapter of my life. It was a deeply unsettling time, a prelude to the breaking point that was slowly but inevitably approaching. As I looked at my swelling belly in the mirror, my eyes blurred with tears, I knew something had to give. I couldn't bring my children into a home filled with animosity and emotional neglect. Something had to change, and deep down, I knew that change had to start with me. The arrival of my beautiful twins, Emma and Ethan, was a bittersweet experience. They were born healthy, and the moment I held them in my arms, I felt an indescribable love, a fierce protectiveness. They were the purest things in my life, and they deserved so much better than the household they were born into. "Congratulations, Chloe. They're beautiful," Ben murmured in the hospital room, his gaze flitting over the babies for a moment before returning to his phone. "Thanks, Ben," I replied, a lump forming in my throat. This was yet another moment lacking the warmth and unity it should have had. Back at home, Karen had firmly planted herself as the matriarch. She should have been a supportive presence, but instead, her demands escalated to absurd levels. Now, not only was I managing a full-time job from home, but I was also nursing twins, dealing with sleep deprivation, and bending to Karen's ever-changing whims. "Chloe, the house is a mess. Don't you have any pride?" Karen would snarl, lounging on the sofa as if she owned the place. "I've been up all night feeding the twins, Karen. I'll clean when I can," I'd reply, exhaustion weighing down my words. "But you're home all day. How hard can it be?" she'd retort. All the while, Ben continued his pattern of emotional absenteeism. His contributions to our family life were negligible. His efforts to find a job were non-existent. Instead, he spent his days gaming, talking to friends online, and leaving the child, drearing entirely to me. "Ben, could you please watch the kids for an hour? I have an important meeting," I'd request, my voice tinged with desperation. Can't you reschedule? I'm in the middle of a game," he'd reply, not even bothering to look up from his screen. And so, my life became a living nightmare. Despite my exhaustion, I found it hard to sleep, plagued by worries about my children's future and the decaying relationship with my husband. I loved Emma and Ethan so much, and it broke my heart to think that they might grow up in a household devoid of love and respect between their parents. The worst part, I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of societal expectations, family duty, and my own fears about breaking up my family. But the breaking point came during a particularly tense family dinner. Karen, in her usual fashion, had been criticizing my cooking, my housekeeping, and even my abilities as a mother. As I was serving dessert, her venom reached new heights. "You know, Chloe, you're really a sponger, living off Ben even though he's the one who's unemployed. You're a terrible mother." It was the slap that followed her words that jolted me. The room went silent, the air thick with tension and disbelief. Ben looked up, finally tearing himself away from his perpetual distractions. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, shame, guilt, but it was quickly replaced by his now customary apathy. "Mom, you shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low, but there was no conviction, no outrage on my behalf. It was then that I realized, enough was enough. I couldn't live like this any longer. I had 2 children to protect and a life to reclaim. I was done being the victim of my circumstances. As I stood there, my cheeks stinging from the physical and emotional blows, something within me crystallized. This was the end of the road for my suffering, but it was also the beginning of something new. It was time to take action. It was time to take my life back. That slap resonated within me, a violent echo that shattered any illusions I still had about my marriage and my place in this family. It was my breaking point, yes, but it was also a point of reckoning, a crystallizing moment that pulled all my suppressed fears, frustrations, and indignations into sharp focus. As I retreated to my home office under the guise of needing to catch up on work, my thoughts churned in a whirlpool of emotion and strategy. I had 2 beautiful children relying on me, a career that had ironically been demeaned despite being the sole financial support of this household, and a life that was unraveling at the seams. I had to act, and I had to act fast. After some thorough research, my first step was a trip to the police station, where I filed a report detailing the abuse I'd endured, especially the recent assault. Their professionalism and support fortified my resolve. I was doing the right thing. "Mrs. Davis, we take these allegations seriously. We'll start an investigation immediately," assured Officer Lewis, taking down the details. "Thank you, officer. I need to protect my children and myself," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd felt in years. Next, I consulted with a divorce attorney. I laid out my case, providing evidence of my financial contributions, a record of Karen's abuse, and proof of Ben's complicity and neglect. "Given your situation and the evidence you've presented, I'm confident we can secure a favorable outcome for you and your children," said the attorney, flipping through the documents I had prepared. "Let's proceed then. I can't let this go on any longer," I said, signing the retainer agreement with a sense of grim determination. The next weeks were a blur of legal procedures, meetings, and court appearances, all while managing my job and taking care of Emma and Ethan. It was exhausting, but each step forward fueled my determination. I was fighting for my life and the lives of my children, and each legal victory was a chink in the armor that had held me captive for so long. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived, the divorce trial. Ben and Karen looked visibly rattled as the proceedings unfolded, their faces paling as my attorney laid out our case with surgical precision. "Your Honor, Mrs. Davis has been the sole provider of this household, enduring emotional and physical abuse, all while Mr. Davis and his mother have contributed nothing but suffering to this family," my attorney argued, displaying the evidence for the court to see. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Davis?" the judge asked, eyeing Ben with an expression of stern expectation. I didn't realize it had gotten this bad," Ben stammered, his voice tinged with something that might have been regret. "Realization, Mr. Davis, is not a substitute for responsibility," the judge replied, delivering the final ruling. Divorce granted. Custody of the children goes to Mrs. Davis, along with the majority of assets and property. As for the abuse claims, they will be separately investigated and appropriate charges will be filed. As the judge's gavel fell, so did the weight that had been suffocating me for years. I looked over at Ben and Karen. Their faces were masks of disbelief and despair. But instead of satisfaction, I felt a profound sadness. For the years wasted, for the love that had turned toxic, for the family that could have been but never was. Ben and Karen approached me as I was leaving the courthouse, their eyes swollen, their faces etched with defeat. "Chloe, can't we talk about this? Can't we find a way to make it right?" Ben pleaded, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Ben. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together," I said, walking away without looking back. I returned to my home, my sanctuary, where Emma and Ethan awaited, blissfully unaware of the storm that had raged outside. Holding them close, I knew I had fought for something priceless. I had fought for their future, and for mine, and for the first time in years, that future seemed not just hopeful, but boundless. It was the end of a painful chapter, and the beginning of whatever came next. I was ready. The court had spoken, the gavel had fallen, and the ink had dried on the divorce papers. Ben and Karen had a week to vacate my house. As the reality of the situation began to settle, I experienced a flood of emotions, relief, exhaustion, but also a sense of rebirth. With the custody of Emma and Ethan secured, and my financial contributions rightfully acknowledged, I had carved out a sanctuary where we could start anew. But first, there were loose ends to tie up. Ben and Karen had been ordered to pay $100,000 in compensation for the emotional and physical suffering they had caused me. A sum that, while it could never truly compensate for the years of abuse, would nonetheless serve as a reminder to them of the cost of their actions. As the week passed, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense. Ben was frantically searching for a place to live, and Karen, bereft of her throne, was quiet for the first time in years. 2 days before their eviction date, Karen approached me. "Chloe, can we talk?" Curiosity piqued. I agreed. "Sure, let's talk." She took a deep breath. "Look, we've gotten off on the wrong foot." "On the wrong foot," I interrupted, incredulous. "Karen, you made my life a living hell. You've done a lot more than step on my toes." I know, and I'm sorry, but can't we find a way to work things out? For the sake of the family." Her voice quivered with what might have been genuine remorse or just a realization of her diminishing options. "A bit late for that, don't you think?" Karen sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Well, I had to try. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." Later that day, Ben tried his own version of a peace offering. "Chloe, I've been doing some thinking, and I realize now that I've been a terrible husband. If you give me another chance, I promise to be better." I looked into his eyes, searching for a sliver of sincerity. All I saw was desperation. "Your promises have lost all value, Ben. It's over." The eviction day arrived, and a moving truck pulled up in front of the house. As Ben and Karen carried their belongings out, their faces were ashen, the weight of their defeat finally sinking in. As they prepared to leave, Ben looked back at me. "You didn't have to do this, Chloe." "Oh, but I did! For me, for Emma and Ethan, I had to put an end to this nightmare. I had to teach you both that actions have consequences." "Will you ever forgive us?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I might in time," I said, "but that doesn't mean you're welcome back into our lives. Some things can't be undone." And with that, I closed the door behind them, both literally and metaphorically. It was the end of an agonizing chapter, but as I looked around my home, my sanctuary, I felt the promise of a new beginning. I called the twins to the living room, where we danced, played, and laughed. For the first time in years, the laughter wasn't a veneer masking sorrow. It was a spontaneous outpouring of joy. As I tucked them into bed that night, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had faced the lions in my life and emerged victorious. More importantly, I had protected my children and secured their future. My revenge was complete, but it wasn't vindictive. It was liberating. I had taken back control of my life, shown the people who had wronged me that they couldn't break me. And in doing so, I had set a new course for myself and my children, steering us away from a cycle of abuse and unhappiness. As I sat down to work the next morning, my home office felt different, lighter, full of potential. I glanced at a framed photo of Emma and Ethan, their eyes brimming with the innocent wonder of childhood, and made a silent vow to protect that wonder at all costs. My journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. But whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it, with my head held high and my spirit unbroken. Finally,